Welcome back. Today we'll continue looking at the Middle Ages. For this lecture, we will focus on the concept of marriage. And we're going to see how it kind of evolves during this period of, particularly the early Middle Ages into the high Middle Ages. A lot of times we talk about marriage being traditional or those type of kind of arguments. And as you read in the textbook, we find that marriage is anything but traditional. Every era, even Western civilization, has its own interpretation of what marriage is, depending on the time period. And the Middle Ages is a place where the Catholic Church is actually trying to define the concept of marriage, but understand that the Catholic Church never owned this concept. It was a very secular concept, and eventually they took it over. So for those of us that believe that there is such a thing as traditional marriage that is kind of controlled by the Catholic Church, that's more of a myth that's created around this time period than actual reality. So people have been getting married before this era, and a lot of times it happened independent of the Catholic Church. But during this period, 9th, 10th century, it's when the Church really begins to take it over. So we're going to look at how the Church defines this notion of marriage. So we're going to look at different elements that eventually become politicized. So they're not doing it just for kicks, right? There is this element of social control happening here. Number two, we're going to explain the impact it has on daily life. So once they begin to define what is marriage, it begins to shape other aspects of life that might not be tied to the concept of marriage, but shapes it anyways. And one great example that you all read was literature with Le Mot d'Arthur, the whole Beaumont and the whole concept of knighthood and all that kind of good stuff. There's a reason why these stories begin to be created during this period, because most of these people were in very unhappy marriages. So there's no coincidence there, right? They're definitely connected. And as the Church begins to define what is marriage, the nobility begins to push back, because the Church makes it very restrictive as to who you can and can't marry, and the state is not happy with that. And as you read in the textbook, many of these medieval kings and nobles were accustomed to a different concept of marriage. A lot of times they had many wives or many partners, and that was considered okay. And then the Catholic Church stepped in and kind of took that away and implemented the concept of monogamy. So we find that many of them felt uncomfortable with being forced to follow these rules that they did not implement, but rather this religious organization. So we'll see how the state begins to challenge the Church when it comes to this concept of marriage. Before we begin, I'm going to tell you a bit of a story from the Middle Ages. It's one of these kind of great, if you will, case studies of what happens when the Church tries to enforce its beliefs onto the nobility. And it's a messy story, but that's what makes it so intriguing. It's one of these great scandals of this era. So I begin by looking at I think it's the great-grandson of Charlemagne. You read about Charlemagne, so hopefully you know who he is. And as you notice that when Charlemagne passed away, he gave his land to his son, Louis, and then he in turn had 3 sons, and he gave all 3 kids his land. And then, it kind of goes on and on and on, where the kids end up giving land away, right, to all their kids. So one of the grandsons, Lothar II, who was the son of Lothar, has a wife. Her name is Thunberga. And they have been married for some time, and essentially they get tired of each other. And for one reason in particular is that Thunberga could not have kids. She was barren. So Lothar, her husband, accuses her of incest. And I'll talk about the specifics in a minute. And he says that she actually did conceive a child, but through a use of sorcery. So it gets, again, great medieval scandal. Now, Lothar had a mistress, and as you read, many of these medieval kings had mistresses. It was very common, it was very, if you will, natural for them to have mistresses. Charlemagne had many, even though he had official wives, he still had a lot of partners, sexual partners, always cheating on his wife. But Lothar is no different. He had this mistress, her name was Waldrada, and he actually did have children with her. This is where the story gets complicated. So Lothar, in order to try to divorce his wife, began to blame his wife, or accuse her of having sexual relations with her own brother, Hubert. And the church wasn't too happy with this because the church felt, well, look, you made this commitment to this woman. You knew she was a virgin when you first married. Why are you complaining now? By this period, the Catholic Church is beginning to establish the rules as to what is marriage. So, Lothar had claimed that his wife had had anal intercourse with her brother and had conceived a child through sorcery, through occult means. So yes, she was a virgin when they married, but she had actually had this other form of sexual activity, so he would have never known this, right? This thing becomes a big old scandal. Thorberga, his wife, is obviously embarrassed, and she has in kind of good medieval fashion, she has somebody protect her honor. So there's no, divorce court happening here, but rather the will of God is supposed to show innocence. So what she does is that she gets herself a champion. It's something called the ordeal, where she gets herself a champion to represent her. And they and through this process, you're supposed to find innocence or guilt. So this man represents her. They have a pot of boiling water, and they insert his hand and into this boiling pot of water, and then they take it out, and the priest is there to sprinkle water, holy water, on his hand, and depending on the way it heals, will be kind of proof of her innocence or guilt. Well, and again, there you see the church, the state's all involved in this thing, in this event. So what happens is that, lo and behold, his hand heals fine. And it proves, according to medieval logic, that God favors her and that she's telling the truth. Therefore, Lothar is a liar and he must take her back. Well, Lothar's not happy with that, obviously, right? Because he wants a divorce and he wants children so he can pass on his property to the next generation. But because the ordeal was done and she was proven innocent, he must take her back. Well, this other person, Gunthar, who's an archbishop, church official, within the court of Lothar, gets involved, and he claimed that his wife, Thunberga, had actually made a secret confession to him about this whole, incest incident. So what happens is that the bishops basically allow him to get divorced. They allow him to get married to Waldrada, but not everybody's happy. So what happens? Well, this man named Hincmar, he gets involved in this case. And he's not very happy that a king let his wife go and just married some other woman. So he begins to question the case. He has a few kind of key questions. Number one, he says, well, a king can't just go off divorcing women because, if he does it, everybody else is going to do it, right? A king must lead by example. It's like our president today, right? If we see him as a moral authority, or her, right? Whoever we have as president. And we kind of look to them as an example of good moral character. So if he's going to do these things, then why can't we, right? If he's going to leave his wife, why can't we do that? Number two, how is it possible for his wife to engage in this sexual act with her brother and without having vaginal sex actually have produce a child. So he begins to question, the specifics of this event. Number 3, he argues that bishops cannot sanction divorce, particularly if somebody of this status, right? He's a king. So how can a bishop okay a divorce? If you're Catholic, you know that only the Pope can sanction a divorce. And lastly, the relationship between Gunther, who's within the realm of Lothar, their relationship is just way too close. Of course, he's going to favor Lothar because he's dependent on Lothar. At this time, the relationship between church and state tends to be very close. A lot of times, kings would select archbishops. That's something we don't do today, right? Something that happens later in some of the reform movements of the High Middle Ages. But this is the early Middle Ages, right? This is the 9th century. So, of course, Gunther's going to agree with him. He's a yes man, basically. So this case gets very messy. There's a whole book on it. It's very fascinating. But you also have uncles who are involved in this case too, because if Lothar can't have any kids, it means that the land basically goes back to this family, and his uncles can actually claim authority over it. So you have Charles the Bald and Louis the German, sons of Louis, that can actually ask for this land. So what happens? Well, they hold a synod, which is basically like a group of church bishops getting together to talk about this case, and they actually agree with Lothar. They actually allow him to get a divorce. However, nobody told the Pope this. So the Pope actually gets involved and tells him, look, you can either take your wife back, or if you don't, you will be excommunicated from the church. Now, understand that excommunication, for the most part, most of us probably wouldn't care if we were to excommunicate each other, but in the context of the Middle Ages, there is this spiritual element, right? If you're excommunicated, you're no longer within the church, you're not going to go to heaven, all that kind of good stuff in the afterlife. But in the real material world, the thing with excommunication is that you're no longer recognized. So this kind of showcases the power of the church, right? The church asserting its power over lay society, where if the church excommunicates you, basically nobody recognizes your realm. So yes, you can call yourself king, but nobody around you treats you like one. Nobody, your land essentially becomes available to whoever wants it. So excommunication has some form of authority in the real world. It's not just a spiritual power that the Pope has. Well, in this particular case, what happens is that Lothar, once he hears that the Pope gets involved, he actually goes to Rome and asks for forgiveness. And they tell him, take your wife back. And he ends up taking her back, but he puts her up in some tower, basically, or kind of gets her own place, and they live apart from each other and just kind of live that way. She thinks she becomes a nun. So this example really kind of shows how complicated this concept of marriage is, right? And things that we still kind of hold true today if you're Catholic, right? That you cannot get divorced no matter what, at least in Catholic faith. Here we see a great example of that, of the church kind of asserting these concepts as to what is marriage, who can you marry, and can anybody kind of sanction a divorce? So the church is trying to limit that, really, and really implement the sense of monogamy, because prior kings, they were accustomed to sleeping around, and the church is trying to put an end to that. So let's continue looking at the evolution of the concept of marriage. We looked at that one story of Lothar and his wife Hardrada, which kind of highlights some of the major conflicts when it comes to defining the concept of marriage in the early Middle Ages. So during the same time, the church is trying to establish what the rules are in order to marry somebody. And it's a very, I guess today we'll call it traditional, but it's only traditional because it's being created during this period, right? So one of the kind of major focus of this early period of marriage is this concept of sex. So I talked about it in a previous lecture, this concept of asceticism. And the church was held pretty strongly to this idea that people should not engage in sexual activity, right? That the whole point was to control your animalistic urges. However, the reality is that not all people can do this, so they very much so understood that people needed to engage in sexual activity. So one thing that they established was the idea of engaging in sexual activity, but only for procreation, right? You're not supposed to have sex for pleasure. Another idea implemented around this time in the early Middle Ages was the elimination of polygamy, as we mentioned that as Christianity begins to go into these regions that were pagans at one time, so England, France, Germany, they had their own rituals, they had their own sexual standards and concepts of relationships. And polygamy was probably one of the most common types of relationships. Many kings during this period had multiple partners, multiple wives. And it's the Catholic Church that begins to implement its ideals onto these people. So something that they saw very natural, i.e. polygamy, was now considered a crime under the eyes of the church. However, they still practice this idea, as we see many kings having many partners. So I think the book highlights this point too, right, where monogamy begins to be established. So they can no longer marry many women, but definitely only have one wife, and that is kind of recognized by the church. Another kind of question in regards to marriage is, who can you marry? So before the rise of Christianity, you have something called the Roman method, where basically this is a list of who you can't marry, right? Your parents, your grandparents, uncles, aunts, and first cousins. So if your family tree is connected somewhere along these lines, then you cannot marry any of these people, particularly when it comes down to cousins. So remember that during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, society kind of contracts, right? Civilizations get smaller. I mentioned this, that Rome at one time had 1 million people. During this period, 5th, 6th century, they only have about 250,000 people, right? Now imagine the rest of Europe, particularly places like France, where societies are even smaller and people are going to be much more closer connected. So they actually get rid of this kind of concept during the early Middle Ages, because basically if your cousin had a kid and you wanted to marry them, then you could. So it's in the 8th century where they begin to implement these new rules. So some of those things that I just highlighted, right? Sex is not for pleasure, it's only for procreation. Monogamy begins instituted. They begin to implement this idea, which I'll talk about in a minute, consanguinity. And it's St. Boniface who kind of introduces it into church dogma. So understand, none of this is in the Bible. This is all the Catholic Church creating as they kind of go along, right? They also argue that you cannot marry extended family. So wife, sisters, and I think this is actually in the Bible. But you also can't marry like godparents, because a lot of times these relationships are established for political gain, or at least economic gain, right? If those of you have godparents, you probably have them that are economically well off. It's part of the reason why we choose certain godparents, because we know that if you were to die, you can take care of their kids, right? But this is probably the most interesting thing, is that this concept of consanguinity. So please pay attention to this concept. Because what the Catholic Church does is eliminates the Roman method that we talked about earlier. So again, you cannot marry any of these people, but if it goes down your family tree this way, then you can marry them. Or, if you go back to your great-grandparents and the family tree kind of branches out this way, you could marry people from that family tree. By the 8th century, though, they basically eliminate that. So here you are, and you can see you cannot marry, obviously parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, all the way back to 7 generations back. Now, all these people will be dead by then, right? At least a good number of them will be dead, so it's not going to marry any of these people. But if you can trace your genealogy back 7 generations, we're talking about 200 years maybe, somewhere around there, right? Then theoretically, you should not be able to marry anybody down this family tree. Now, understand that this is the Dark Ages, what people have labeled the Dark Ages, and they don't keep records of any of this information, right? Most of us today struggle to go back maybe 4 generations. We might know our great-grandparents and maybe our great-great-grandparents, and even then we have to get documents, which, we did pretty good at of having in the last 200 years. Now imagine in the Middle Ages where nobody knows how to read and nobody's keeping records of any of this information. So how is this going to shape up this concept of marriage? And it's going to get really complicated. So again, there's a lot of people involved in defining what is marriage. So we talked about St. Boniface. Here you have Hincmar. You might remember Hincmar. He was involved in the Held Lothar case. And when it comes to the concept of marriage, he says, well, who can you marry and under what conditions? Well, Hincmar argued that you needed consent. Again, the Bible does not give us any specifics as to what the rituals are, but rather these are created later. So consent becomes a very sticking point in the early Middle Ages, where Hincmar argues both parties need to consent, which is quite radical because a lot of times women are just given to other men and say, this is your wife, right? In this particular example, the Catholic Church is saying no. He can consent, but she needs to approve of this relationship too. Now, they might have been coerced into the relationship, but as long as she says yes, then it's a legitimate marriage. Another thing that we find is that women are actually, their dowry is not that important during this period. A lot of times when they try and marry them off, they're given stuff so they can bring into this new household. During this period, it was quite the opposite. Men had to provide their future spouse, future wife, a lot of resources because there's a possibility that they might die. So I think they had to provide certain jewelry, definitely land, a house in particular. So if the husband were to die, she would be taken care of. Now here we're really focusing on the nobility. Obviously poor people do not have a lot of land to be giving away. Another important aspect is this concept of having a public ceremony. So people needed to be aware of who's getting married. Again, a lot of people didn't keep records. So there is this sense of the public being the policing agent to make sure that this person isn't already married. The relationship needed to be consummated, which means basically they needed to engage in sexual activity. And that would be an important element of a relationship, right? So it's not just one, but it's multiple. So all these things are important, particularly as we look after the year 1000 to see how people are trying to change this idea of what constitutes marriage. And really what the Catholic Church is trying to do is limit the ability for the nobility to get divorced, which is something that we see quite central in the Lothar case, right? That he's trying to get out of this relationship. He's getting all these people involved. He's saying that she wasn't a virgin and had engaged in this, occult sexual act with her brother. And in the end, the church is saying, no, you knew all the rules before you got into this relationship, and now you're trying to change them so you can get out because you can't have any kids. Sorry, but you can't do that, right? So the Catholic Church is really trying to eliminate people from obtaining a divorce. Now, many historians have noted that this is quite revolutionary because now that people are consenting, it gives women a voice. Now, this isn't individualism like today, or like even the Renaissance, but instead of somebody just being sold off, right, a woman being kind of sold off to a man, she actually has somewhat of a voice in this relationship, which is something that you don't traditionally see in Western culture. So a lot of times people see the Middle Ages as very backwards. This is a great example where the Middle Ages is somewhat progressive, if you will. So how does this shape not only the concept of marriage, but daily life? So nothing comes out of a vacuum. Well, by the year 1000, people begin to eliminate this idea of giving land to every offspring, particularly male offspring. And they begin to just focus on the firstborn. So they introduce this concept called primogeniture, where the firstborn gets everything. If you can remember Charlemagne's grandkids, they all got a piece of his massive empire, and slowly but surely the empire kind of disintegrates, right, into different kingdoms. Well, that begins to go away by the year 1000. So primogeniture is the idea that the first male born gets everything. And this impacts not only kings, but also nobles, where if you can remember the reading, nobles were actually just kind of leasing land that was given to them by a king, right? It's called that concept of feudalism. And one great example that we see with Charlemagne is that in order to limit the power of his nobility is that he moved them around. That way they wouldn't get too comfortable in a piece of territory. Well, that begins to go away by the year 1000, and nobles begin to establish themselves in certain territories, and they begin to see those territories as their territories. So part of it was militaristic development, where we move away from wood castles into stone castles, but at the same time, we see nobles seeing that territory as theirs, and they are investing in it. So they begin to establish castles such as these. This is actually I think Victorian replica of a medieval castle in Spain. But nevertheless, by the year 1000, we begin to see the establishment of stone castles throughout Europe. Another important change is surnames. So many of us have last names. Obviously, my last name is Landeros. And a lot of times, some of us like to do these genealogies, and we like to trace our last names to these historical figures. And this is something that happens about the year 1000. So most of us who do these type of things, right, this kind of research, cannot go any further than the year 1000. It is very rare for people to go further back. I think the furthest I can think of is maybe the 5th century. There's a family in England that can go back to the 5th century. But for the most part, the year 1000 is where last names really become a thing, if you will. And they become important in this process of marriage. We begin to see the women's position change, as I mentioned earlier that in a previous slide, that men would give women a lot of things when they would marry them, right? It was called the Morgengabe, which is a Germanic mourning gift, and this gift was, again, the land, clothing, jewelry, and housing, right? And some money so she could take care of herself in case she were to die. Well, now that only the first heir gets everything, there are less heirs to marry your daughters off to. So this concept of the Morgengabe begins to disappear, partly because there are not that many eligible bachelors anymore, as there were prior to the year 1000. So instead, we see the inflation of a dowry. This is where a father gives his daughter certain land, or even animals, right? A goat or a cow or something like that. So he marries her off using these things as almost as an incentive, right? That this contributes to the new household, and it expands their territory. So this is very common amongst nobility, where a lot of time it bridges two monarchies together, right? Two massive territories together. So a lot of times these marriages are very political, and the dowry helps in this process. So if the firstborn gets everything, then what happens to all the other kids? Well, you see the development of this idea called the second son, and put that in quotes because it could be the third, fourth, fifth son, where they are essentially disinherited in the early Middle Age, or in this high Middle Ages period. They get nothing. They might get some inheritance, maybe money, or they can go into the church. But basically, the firstborn gets everything, and the second son gets nothing. Now, his options are limited. However, there are possibilities. Maybe the firstborn will die, and he might become king. But you can't really count on that because you might have other brothers waiting in line too. So This concept of the second son shapes the Middle Ages in many ways, which we'll talk as we move forward. So let's continue looking at the development of marriage and how the Middle Ages begins to shape it. Earlier I talked about surnames, right, last names, and how people begin to, even today we do these genealogies to kind of trace it. Well, this becomes very significant in the Middle Ages because record keeping must be done in order to adhere to that seventh generation ideal that the church instituted, right? That concept of consanguinity. So we see the development of things like coat of arms, not so much just because of marriage, but these become important elements to define who you are as an individual in the Middle Ages. And here are some coat of arms. As you can see, this is my, I guess, official coat of arms. But understand that these things are just created out of thin air. Somebody wanted to draw something, so they did, to represent who they were, and there you go. So I did the same thing over here. As you can see, it's a Landeros coat of arms. It's not official, but it doesn't matter, right? It has my dog, my favorite soccer team, my name, some Latin that I put down there. So yeah, you know, again, these become important symbols of this particular era. One of the most significant, particularly in dealing with that concept of consanguinity, are genealogies. Now, genealogies are a way to keep track of who your family relates to in regards to the past. So genealogies are created around this period to determine your family history. And what we find with a lot of people during this period is that they have two very common ancestors. Number one, everybody wants to be connected to Charlemagne because he's such an important historical figure. They become bigger than life, you know, after he dies. And then another person is King Arthur. Now, the problem with all this is that how can everybody be related to this one figure, Charlemagne, or two, King Arthur, who's a fictitious, right, character, right? And it tells you a lot about how these people kind of create this illusion of power through genealogies, right? So here you have somebody, his name is Count Arnulf of Flanders, which you never heard of, and he's not important in regards to historical information for this class, but only for the fact that he is able to create a genealogy and connect it to the Merovingians, right? So he's able to create this fictitious family tree that relates him to King Clotaire, who was a medieval monarch in the 7th or 8th century. So it just kind of goes to show how sometimes we become very creative and construct genealogies, really not because they're true, but more for convenience, right? Because by making this connection to this Merovingian dynasty, it gives them credibility, right? And prestige. So during the Middle Ages, you know, people are creating these genealogies because there's nobody there to challenge them anyway. So if you ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale, where the main character is not nobility, but he hires somebody to create, I think he hires Chaucer to create a genealogy. It's a great example of what's happening during this age, is that people are creating these things and tracing them to these very significant historical, sometimes ahistorical figures, and it buys them legitimacy in this world. To become a noble becomes much more complicated after the year 1000 than prior to the year 1000, so that's when genealogies become so significant. So this concept, right, of consanguinity, the 7th degree, become important because now people need to keep records as to who you're marrying, because if you can find common ancestors, it could be problematic in your relationship. Well, yes, this is good for the church because it limits who they can marry. Some people have argued that they did this because they didn't want them to marry, you know, into families that were kind of nearby them, right? Territories that were so close to them that would just increase their power. So if you if you had to go 7 generations back to find common ancestors, it really meant that you have to marry outside your territory, if not even, the other side of Europe, because there you could be for sure that you're going to be related in some shape or form, right? So, sorry, in the High Middle Ages, you find that nobility trying to challenge the way the Catholic Church defines the concept of marriage. So one of these kind of key figures, and you'll see him in your book, his name is Gratian. He kind of challenges this concept of marriage that the church institutes prior to the year 1000. Number one kind of argument he makes is that, well, do you really need consent, right? Is that really that important? Remember that these, what we call theologians, are using, verses or different elements of the Bible to justify their arguments as to how we define this idea. And Gratian, very important figure in church history, argues, well, you don't really need consent. Remember earlier they said that you did need consent of both parties. Here they're saying that you don't. And he actually argues that really all you need is sex. So if you can have sex with some person, then that's enough to kind of justify that you're married at this time, which could be very problematic particularly for women, right? And he argues that you can marry in complete privacy, that you don't need other people there, which, again, makes it kind of complicated, because what if the woman didn't consent? Maybe she's being forced into this relationship and there's nobody there to hear whether she wants to be in this relationship or not. So Gratian is kind of treading very, very fine line here, but he's able to justify it using verses here and there to reach such a conclusion. And there are many of these type of people who are making these arguments. Basically, they're almost like divorce lawyers for the Middle Ages to help people get into relationships. Another important figure is Peter Lombard. He says, no, Gratian, you're actually wrong. You do need consent. Consent is much more important, and sex is not, right? So there's a lot of back and forth happening here between theologians, right? We church thinkers, in other words, to try to define this idea of marriage. And things are getting really complicated, because who do we listen to? Do we agree with this guy? Do we agree with this guy? Do we go back to Hincmar? And sometimes kings are just tired of their wives, and wives are tired of their husbands, and they kind of find ways to get divorced too. So one great example is Louis VII, who him and Eleanor are just kind of tired of each other. And Eleanor of Aquitaine owns a lot of territory. I think she brings in like 3/4 of France into his realm. And they actually find that they have a common ancestor going back generations. And this allows them to get divorced. Now, Louis, again, he's tired of her, and vice versa. But the interesting thing here is that Eleanor goes off and marries Louis's nemesis, which is Henry II. And, all of a sudden she divorces him, but also takes her land back, Aquitaine, which is in France. And she marries the King of England, which basically means the King of France is surrounded by the English monarchy. So there's a great example of how a divorce backfired. So by 1215, the Catholic Church says, this is enough. This is getting too ridiculous. It's getting too complicated. Let's settle this issue. Number one, we're not going to go 7 generations back, because anybody can create a family tree and find a common ancestor, if not create a common ancestor, and find means for divorce. So they go back to the 4th degree, which is the Roman method that we talked about earlier. Number two, this wedding must be public, right? People need to hear. Must be announcements. It must be held on Sundays, so people know who's marrying who. Remember that this is mostly for the nobility. Consent is important, so no more of this. What Gratian is arguing, right? Consent must be made by both parties, at the very least, at the ceremony. So she might have been forced into the relationship, and she might have been coerced, maybe even by her parents, because it built some kind of alliances. But nevertheless, if she consents, then she agreed to it, and it's over. So these are just some kind of examples of how marriage becomes so complicated in this period. And the Catholic Church is trying to now define something that they essentially created. Because remember that marriage used to be very secular, particularly even for regular people at this time, people like you and me. They used to just go to a bar and over a round of drinks, they used to announce their basically their love for each other, and they were married with no priest, no religious figure at this event, and that was good enough for them until maybe into the Renaissance or something, where it becomes much more common to go through this this ritual. But here we're really kind of focusing on the nobility. So how does this shape other? We mentioned earlier the second son, right? Well, we mentioned that the second son is completely disinherited, right? He's disenfranchised. He has no opportunity to become king unless his brother dies, which could happen. But for the most part, third, fourth, if you're fifth in line, it's going to be pretty hard for you to become king. Henry II, I think, is a good example where his brothers actually became kings. Henry II dies. Richard Lionheart, the Lionheart becomes king because his two other brothers passed away, and then Richard Lionheart, dies of some war, gets an arrow to the neck, and dies eventually. And his brother John becomes king, and that's part of the whole Robin Hood myth during that era. So there's the possibility of second sons becoming kings, but they're few and far between sometimes. And again, the other brothers must find other ways to make a living. So many of them become knights. As I mentioned earlier, that many of these families trace their genealogies to people like Charlemagne, who are not only powerful kings, but actually in the military. They're actually out there fighting. Or they trace their genealogy back to King Arthur, who are legendary, right, characters. Well, understand that by this period, kings, by the High Middle Ages, which is around 1000 to about 1300, kings no longer are out in the field fighting. It's like our presidents today, right? They send us off to war, but they're not out there fighting. They don't have a gun. They're just sitting in their offices watching to see what happens. They have other people fight for them. Well, that's essentially what happened to many of these kings. They become administrators. So it's the second son. It's their brothers. It's their third, fourth, fifth son who become these knights and go out and adventure and live this life of pleasure. A lot of times, stories like King Arthur become very influential in this culture. So many people want to live this life of violence, right? So they become the example of what the family name kind of traces its genealogy to, right? They become the King Arthurs, the Knights of the Round Table, and they become the Charlemagnes, even though their brother, the king, doesn't do this anymore. It's the second, third, fourth son that engages in this type of warfare because he needs to make a living for himself. They are trained to be knights. What happens to their daughters? Well, their daughters, unlike men who become knights and maybe hopefully can go land a wife somewhere, right? They become an important knight. They can find a wife with some territory and marry them and maybe become a noble of some shape or form. But they really become the rock stars of the Middle Ages. You can see here the women kind of looking down at them, and they're flaunting over these men who live this life of danger, right? Daughters, unfortunately, their life changes quite dramatically because, as I mentioned earlier, now that there are less eligible bachelors who are part of the nobility out there, it's really important that families marry off their daughters to important people. So we find that the marriage age drops to 12 rather than maybe being a little bit later. We find that dowries are inflated. There's nothing sexier than a woman having a lot of acres attached to her. So dowries get inflated quite significantly, as we see with Eleanor of Aquitaine, who brings in 3/4 of France into the French monarchy and into the English monarchy. I mean, who wouldn't want to marry somebody like that, right? That brings in so much territory into their kingdom. And then there's other daughters that you can never marry off, right? So they developed this concept called the béguinage, which basically means the daughters that don't get married, because many times these families have many kids, they don't get married and they become nuns without a convent. They just sit there, kind of live a lifeless, cheerless, chaste life, and because nobody wants them, right? Their sisters were married off, maybe married off well, but because there's so many sisters, some of them don't have that opportunity to get married, so they just get themselves a cat and live a very kind of boring life. So what do we learn? Number one, this concept of marriage and the development of marriage gives rise to the concept of the nuclear family. Your book kind of highlights this idea that by the 10th century, we really see the development of the nuclear family. Number two, we find, like throughout history, people married for power. But the one thing that we do see that's quite unique is that concept of individualism, of consent, where women are allowed to give that opportunity to have a voice in this relationship. And then lastly, and I really want to drive this point home, is this idea that the church takes over this concept of marriage. So when we talk about such kind of nonsensical arguments of traditional marriage, we have to understand that there's no such thing as traditional marriage. It might be traditional in regards to 1,000 years, but it doesn't come from up above. It's actually quite a secular institution that the church decided to take over, and now they're creating the rules. So there's no such thing as traditional marriage, because it's something that's constantly being evolved and shaped by different powers. In this example, the church took it over. Today, we're becoming a lot more secular too, right? People get married through the courts and never enter a church. So it's very problematic when people try to use words like traditional to justify that things should only be one way, because we find that throughout history it's been shaped so much that there's no such thing as traditional. And then lastly, the concept of how marriage impacts daily life. So I mentioned how it impacts the genealogies. It implements the concept of primogeniture, which impacts the development of castles, right? Coat of arms begin to be developed at this time. Obviously, the marriage age drops for women, nobility women to 12, and second sons are created. Now, these are all concepts that I want you to know because we'll be using them as we move forward. So, particularly the concept of the second son, where the son has very few opportunities to go to church or be a knight and kind of bump throughout Europe and try to find yourself a wife. The second son plays a very important role as we move forward into a much more kind of bourgeois economy, right? A capitalist economy. So keep that in mind as we move forward.